In this discussion, we're going to talk about providence and divine action. How is God involved in the world? We assume God creates. We suggest God creates, but then what? What is God's continued presence? What is God's continued role? How do we explain a lot of the events and directions that this world's taken that seems to reflect there is no God, or that God isn't? It's not so clear from our daily lives that God is entirely present. Or if it is clear, it's not clear that God is all-powerful or all-loving. So what do we do with that? How do we hold on to our various points of discussion about God, that God's all-loving, that God's all-powerful, that God is involved, in light of our daily lives, what we see around us, what we see in the news? How do we reconcile these things? If theology isn't able to address these issues, then we have a big problem. And in some ways we do have a big problem because so many who claim the name of Christian aren't able to respond to this, or respond to it in defective ways that leads people away from either questioning this God or having a sufficient enough answer to continue pressing on in service to this God. We may not have the perfect answer, but the inability to answer anything or answer poorly is often worse than no answer at all. So what do we do with this? Well, let's talk about providence and divine action. Any talk about the divine providence in contemporary world poses some serious challenges. There's been a move from a mechanistic or semi-mechanistic Newtonian worldview in which one thing affects the other, and everything makes sense, and everything follows these very distinct laws and rules about if you do this, then this happens. And we do that in morality. If you do wrong things, then bad things happen. If you do good things happen. But that's not necessarily true anymore. Ideas of chaos theory, which involves an immense amount of complexity, and sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and things like this, in which the complexity goes beyond our ability to offer a succinct, clear, deterministic answer, has forced a change from traditional talk about how God guides and perhaps how God determines the course of the world. It doesn't mean we need to get rid of the idea that God guides and is involved in the world, but how we talk about it has changed in light of these new understanding. Christian doctrine of providence, in order to speak to contemporary people, has to then rethink its categories and emphases. The possibility and nature of divine action has become a key philosophical, theological challenge in light of current scientific knowledge. In fact, some are even argue we don't even need a God anymore in light of what we know about the world. We know how complex things function in the world that previous generations needed, they say, to come up with divine beings. How does lightning function? How does the sun move? Well, we know all these things now. And things that we don't know, we say, well, there are answers that we don't need to rely on some kind of divine tool or divine source. Does that mean that we don't need a God at all? I hope not. In fact, no. It just means that how we think about God, how we think about the role of God, how we think about God's involvement in the world has to likewise adapt to contemporary questions and challenges. If we're only answering the questions and challenges of 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, using the language and categories of 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, we're not fulfilling our function as witnesses to the world. How do we witness to a God in our world, in light of what God continues to teach us, both in the past and in contemporary times? Has God remained silent to us, that we're only reliant on teachings from long ago? That's an important question, and it taps into things we've talked about already. 20th century has made things very difficult. Up to the early 1900s, there was a strong understanding that people were getting better, that had left behind the barbarity of the past, that they had been advancing in culture, in relationship, in the ability to dialogue. If we just got together and started talking over things, then we could sort all our frustrations out. And we don't need to rely on the evils of past generations of violence, of hate. Well, then what happened? In the United States, the Civil War happened with its beginning by inability to sort through the horrors of slavery, and then the horrors of the experience of war, and suddenly the romance of war that had been passed down through generations was completely exposed for the falsity that it is. when people were engaged in early forms of trench warfare and the battles and violence that came out of modern technology used in less than modern forms of combat. So post-Civil War America was reeling from the effects of that and the trauma of that. For Europe, it was World War I. The idealism of philosophy and other approaches in up through 19th century Europe came to a sudden end. There was no room for idealism in the trenches of France or Germany or elsewhere. The 20th century continued this. It's 2 world wars, the Jewish Holocaust, innumerable other worldwide crises, from poverty to hunger to nature catastrophes to the realization, the awakening of the horrors of colonialism and the way in which some used others. It's like the scales fell off their eyes, and suddenly we were able to see we're not very good people. And all around the world, it's not just one people, every group. Every history has its horrors. So how do we talk about providence, and goodness, and fairness when we see the Holocaust or the rape of Nanking or so many stories across the world now and in the past? Where is God? What is God doing? In many secular people's minds, the idea of providence, far from being a source of safety and protection as it was in times past, the idea that someone is looking after us in this apparent world of chaos and confusion. Instead, in our era, seems to be a threat to human freedom. The idea that we're being controlled is a barrier to it. We want to be free. We want to have the idea that we can make choices and have options, and there's not someone or something controlling us, forcing us into this pattern. The change of human perception about the world has changed the sense of need of the idea of providence, and then how we can and should talk about it. On the other hand, there's also surprising opportunities in contemporary worldviews to talk about providence. Science are raising the question of teleology. There's a purposefulness in nature. There does seem to be a meaning here, a direction. Consider the anthropic principle. You know what the anthropic principle is? The idea that everything in this world seems to be set up so as to make human existence possible. Change one minor thing and we wouldn't exist. Now, is this a absolute convincing argument? No. Well, if things weren't this way, then we wouldn't be around to notice them. So of course things have to be this way. But it's a contributing discussion. So a revised doctrine of creation and providence, in keeping with biblical orientations and contemporary dynamic worldview, might not only be able to initiate dialogue and not only be able to review previous patterns, but also might be able to be convincing. Any theological topic, providence has tended to divide the mind of theologians and theological movements, such as between Arminians and Calvinists. Not only do we have a hard time convincing those outside of Christianity, we have a hard time convincing each other, coming to agreement. Well, there's an issue there. And it suggests that one side or the other isn't entirely have the right ideas. Oftentimes it comes out of asking different kinds of questions within this bigger topic, or focusing on different themes of of God's definition, and trying to come to terms with one part. We are frustrated with others who are coming from a different direction, and we think we're talking about the whole thing, and we just have arguments about it, and yet we're talking past each other so often. In the midst of these debates, Christian theology has missed the point that both the camps do believe in providence. They just tend to formulate the idea of providence in different ways. This isn't just true about providence. We'll come back to this when we come to the idea of election and soteriology, the doctrines of salvation. So often we're talking about different themes and thinking we're arguing against each other when in fact we're just contributing in different ways. And we need to listen better. The Bible does not present a systematic doctrine of providence. The Bible also doesn't run away from the idea of providence. It speaks of various facets of God's providential work over his creation, and these can be grouped into 2 wide categories. First, there's preservation. God keeps creation going. We see this in Nehemiah 9:6, Colossians 1:17, Hebrews 1:3. God continues to be involved over his people. And we see this in Exodus 1. For individuals, the book of Daniel, God continues to be engaged, keeping us, even in the necessities of life. God is also involved in the guidance and government. He's not just, he keeps things in good running order. We exist, but we also are being patterned and led, nature and animal creation. Psalm 135, 5 through 7, Matthew 5:45, Psalms 104, 21 through 29. He doesn't just exist to keep us existing. There's a engagement, a will over human history and the destiny of the nations. Daniel 2:21. Daniel 4:24 through 25, Isaiah 10, 5 through 12. I'm not going to go through these passages, but by all means, hit pause or stop this and look these up. Dwell on these. Dwell on how God guides and governs individuals. In 1 Samuel 2, 6 and 7, Luke 1:52, 1 Corinthians 4, 6 through 7, over different occurrences of life in Proverbs 16:33. God is involved, even over sinful actions of humans. In Acts 2:23, 2 Samuel 24:1, which is 1 Chronicles 21:1. God's involved. The Bible says God's involved, even if it doesn't give this is the specifics of all the nuances of your questions. What it tells us pretty clearly. Trust in God. So that's the theme of the Exodus passages, right? The idea that we're to trust that God who promises is the God who will fulfill his promises. But God, I'm thirsty. What about this? What about that? He doesn't often answer us. Keep trusting. The basic biblical idea about providence is that God is committed to preserving and providing for the life of creation. In the Old Testament, this is most often expressed with the idea of the Spirit as the sustainer of all life. This isn't a class on pneumatology, on the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, but all topics in theology relate to each other and bring in the triune persons. Here we'll talk about the Spirit. When you send your Spirit, they are created. You renew the face of the earth in Psalm 104:30. All life perishes when God withdraws his Spirit. This is in the early passages of Genesis as well as the passages mentioned here. This is a key theme. The Ruach, the breath of life. Souls of all living things and the breath of all people are in the hands of the Spirit. When God gives his Spirit, there is life. When God takes away his Spirit, there is death. So the presence of God's Spirit is an engaged personal interaction with what is going on in the world. Patristic theology. With the doctrine of providence, the church opposed the Epicurean notion that the world is governed by chance, and also opposed the Stoic view that the world is ruled by fate. Life is not either a throw of the dice or just what will happen. God is personally involved in this, even if in a complicated way that doesn't always make sense to us. The Bible doesn't avoid that. The whole book of Job is this idea that God is doing something beyond our ability, and we are allowed to argue, we're allowed to process, we're involved, we're allowed to get engaged. What we're not allowed to do is give up faith. A growing concern later on, especially with Augustine, was to oppose the idea that God would be any source of evil, at least directly. He maintained God's sovereignty by defending the reality of second causes, the human will as a source of sin, for instance. There are other things involved in this story that interact with God's own work. The theology of the Middle Ages, the doctrine of providence played an important role in the theology, but there was little controversy. There was much more agreement in a world in which they needed God to make sense to the world, and in which the church was able to define the religious conversations of the society. There was a little interest in trying to negate that, because where else would you turn? Aquinas, whose picture is there, defined providence as the exemplar of the order of things toward their end, which exemplar pre-exists in God's mind. Protestant reformers Calvin and Zwingli subscribed to the Augustinian doctrine of divine providence, which emphasized heavily God's sovereignty and foreknowledge. Robert Olson calls this meticulous providence, with the idea that God is involved in every little tiny thing. Everything that happens is God's direct involvement. For Luther, the focus of providence was linked integrally with soteriology, the idea it's really about bringing people into this place of salvation. Calvin and Reformed theology are very well known for a strong Augustinian idea of God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty really is the defining element of theological discussion. Everything revolves around this issue of God's sovereignty. Sovereignty is not viewed as an attribute, but rather a prerogative. God the Creator has an intrinsic right to be supreme over all the works of his hand. God is involved. And this is the reality of God being Lord is this right. We can't complain or argue. We can't protest. This is what God's very definition of godness. God rules over all reality and all realms of life. Calvin writes, "There is no random power or agency or motion in the creatures who are so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what he has knowingly and willingly decreed." Thus, Calvin affirmed the doctrine of predestination. So we're leading into the idea of how our creation theology reflects into our soteriology, which will come into in coming units. By predestination, he writes, we mean the eternal decree of God by which he determined with himself whatever he wished to happen with regard to everyone. All are not created on equal terms, but some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation, and accordingly, as each has been created for one or the other of these ends, we say that he has been predestinated to life or death. This is the idea that God is sovereign. God's involvement in the world, the very definition of God, implies, and for some insists, that God is part of everything, part of every decision, part of every issue. There's nothing that's apart from God's intent and purpose, the way he ordains things. Otherwise, if something happens without God's knowledge or God's purpose, is he really God? This leads to a doctrine of the decrees of God in Reformed theology, such as defined in the Westminster Catechism, in which we read, "The decrees of God are his eternal purpose, according to the counsel of his will, whereby for his own glory he hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass." Protestant orthodoxy or scholasticism defined providence in a way that became the standard for centuries to come, the assumed position. Preservation is that continuous agency of God by which he maintains in existence the things he has created, together with the properties and powers with which he has endowed them. Concurrence is the cooperation of divine and human powers, a further outworking of preservation. For creatures to act as they do requires God's cooperation. This will come back to this in a more specific way when we talk about soteriology and election. Government and governance, or providence proper, refers to God's teleological care, his work towards bringing us to a specific end, and control over God's creation. God directs creation towards his intended goal. Now, the Arminian camp reacted to the Calvinist view and advocated what is called a view of limited providence, as Roger Olson puts it. He writes, "The basic idea of the Arminian tradition is the idea of God self-limiting, namely that God could control nature and history meticulously, but chooses not to. Instead, in this view, God restrains himself for the sake of a certain limited degree of autonomy of both nature and human agency. Limited providence regards God as presently sovereign in both nature and history de jure by right, but not sovereign de facto in actuality. Only in the future, when his kingdom fully arrives, will God be sovereign de facto as well as de jure. This view affirms God's omnipotent ability to control and his permission of whatever is happening." Now, why do we have something like this? Well, the question is often put in terms of, does one group believe in God's sovereignty or the other? And that's not really the right way of framing it. Really the issue at hand between the more hardline Calvinists or Reformed and the more open Arminians is the idea of what is God choosing to do with his sovereignty. For some, God's sovereignty is just the way things are and how God effectively must behave. For others, they say, well, God in a relational approach to the world can choose to not be involved in something in order to let things come to pass, in order for this relational element to be highlighted rather than a strictly functional view. What is God able to choose in his sovereignty? Can God choose not to act? Must God act in order to affirm his sovereignty in everything? Or can God step back and let things happen in ways that he may not in fact prefer, but which, in allowing them to work out in their own way with his involvement, may lead to a more developed purpose? That really is the fundamental argument. But the idea of providence itself is tricky, as even that debate reflects. Where's the place of human freedom? Do we have choice? What about evil and sin and all these things that happen? Do we say that God created sin and God in fact leads people to sin? Do we say that all the evils of the world, slavery, cancer, go on down the list of these things that are evils, did God intend that? Or do we see people making human choices over and against other people is unfortunate, and God wants something better for us? Or do we see the ravages of cancer or other natural evils going on as being a product of just the state of this world in its current incomplete sense? Well, what is God's role? Can we blame God? And these are such strong arguments in contemporary conversations, in fact, going through the Enlightenment, that there is a big reason to protest against God. How can we believe in a God who is all-powerful and all-living in light of these things? One of these other things have to go, and maybe God himself has to. So in modern theology, the kind of theology that arose in the Enlightenment, the doctrine of providence becomes marginal as we look to the turn towards immanentism, the idea that God's intimately connected in this world. There's the focus on the transcendent or the supernatural is taken away, and a lot of that then is takes away the argument of an issue of providence. And then we turn to the human subject. Are we ourselves our own determining subject, and what is then our role in this? Liberal theology equated providence with the purposeful force which directed the evolutionary process. The idea of providence is this movement towards progress, this movement towards betterment. This is where a lot of the idealism view came in. The idea we're progressing more and more. But again, that we run into the wall of the Civil War in America and World War I, where you just run into this idea that is this purposeful reality, when suddenly we're confronted with the fact that we're not any better than those who came before. We can be just as horrible to each other. Deists ruled out providence of God in their belief that God withdrew. There's a certain segment of deism that believes God created the world, got things moving, and now it's just going its own way, which relieves God of some of the responsibility and the blame, and gives humanity responsibilities. Is it our purpose then to get things back into shape if they fall apart? In contemporary interpretations of providence, it's a great challenge because we're confronted more and more and more with this complexity of the evils in the world, the darkness in the world, the lack of fairness, and yet our very interpretation of fairness. What is it? What do we have in that? Why do we think life should be fair or just? And even in light of that, there's these promising explorations as we look at where science itself is suggested that maybe there's some kind of order in this world. It's complex. It throws out our earlier simplistic approaches, but doesn't throw it out altogether. Among mainline theologians, Pannenberg sticks with the classical threefold typology, but revises their meaning in light of a contemporary dynamic worldview. And having a robust pneumatology, a strong doctrine of the Spirit, allows him to reframe discussions in light of classical and current views in a way that is very useful. Not all theologians have such a strong understanding of the Spirit that allows this to take shape. It's actually relatively rare in the Western world up to the last few decades. Another mainline Lutheran theologian, Hans Swartz, has recently presented a viable interpretation of providence that negotiates between traditional formulations and contemporary needs. The basic theological assertion about providence is the principle of contingency of the world. The world was created out of nothingness and is continuously under the threat of non-being. God's involvement, then, is part of this challenge. The world is enveloped by God, he writes, who is present to it as a whole as well as to its individual entities. To explain providence, he utilizes the classical twofold division between general and special providence. Preservation within nature shows off its dependability on God. Dependability is represented in the rising and setting of the sun, the cycles of season, as well as in natural processes on a large scale. This is repeating a large number of chemical reactions. Dependability is also represented in the evolutionary process of the universe and life itself. Our world has the history it has, rather than other histories. There's a movement in God's direction and purposes. Things don't always have to happen the way we think they have to happen. We can depend on them happening because of God's presence ordering them. This is a reminder somewhat of the ancient assumption of having to placate the gods in order to get the sun to rise. But it's not quite that. It's an understanding, even in light of scientific purposes, things can happen that knock things off track. Preservation through moral conduct means that God preserves his creation, especially humanity, from destruction and self-annihilation, a really modern concept, by granting certain guidelines as how to relate to others and to the world. There's traffic laws, we can say, in our dealings with this world and with each other. Conscious and natural law are some means by which God is working in the area of providence. God isn't absent. God works and moves and speaks and guides and reminds. Preservation through the historical process indicates that the historical process is open to more than one interpretation. Special providence, in Hans Schwartz's typology, discusses the topics of miracles and prayer, which we'll get to in other parts of this topic. For Schwartz, the basic biblical affirmation is that God is sovereignly able to bring to completion his saving purposes. But not everything that happens in history is decreed by God. God will win, we can say, but this leaves open elements beyond our own understanding or purpose. Things that aren't specifically related to this. God's not going to lose, but things can happen that may make it seem like that at times. But it's only in light of eschatology that final assessment can be made as to the meaning of God's guidance of history. If you stop in the middle of a story, you're not always able to interpret well why things have happened, what characters have done. Same thing with history. If at this moment in time we try to interpret everything that's happened and try to come up with reasons for it, we have an insufficient view. It's only at the end, when everything has wrapped together, when we can see it from this perspective of its ultimate conclusion, that we can look back and say, oh. I can do that in some ways in my own life. I look back at the journey I've taken over life, and during certain times I think God has left me, or God's abandoned me. I don't know where God is. God's not teaching me anything here. I'm praying for wisdom and guidance, and God is just silent and not doing anything. Where are you, God? And cried out to him. And I look back at those seasons now and say, oh, God was there. God was working in that circumstance that I didn't have any explanation for. And it may not have been fun. I may look back and say, I wish that didn't happen. But I can also look back and say, you know what, that made me into a particular kind of person. Maybe aware in a way that I might not have been aware before. When you grow up, for instance, in a lot of poverty or being kicked out of houses or something, it's not make sense for when you're young, but when you're older, I realize how much those kind of things has affected my theology, my pastoral response to people. I don't have an idealistic view of the world or life. I identify with people who are broken on the side of the road, who take 2.5-hour bus trips, or who don't have enough money to pay for school or even food. Well, how does that then affect my theology and my interest in discussing these ways of God? It affects me radically. But then the things that are happening now, or things I look back and think, I still don't know how to explain that. And maybe I won't. Maybe it's something that was a experience of sin, or my own, or someone else's. They were supposed to do something they didn't, or I was supposed to do something and I wasn't listening. But I can look back only at the end of all things where I say, oh, God's care in this. We do this with the Exodus narrative. It's very easy for us to look at the people of Israel and say, why were they complaining? God was doing this great work. Why are they frustrated? What are they building this golden calf for? When Moses is up there on the mountain, we look back and we read ahead and we see the story as it's whole, and we judge them, and we do the exact same things. We're impatient about God's work, so we build idols. And we don't fashion them out of gold necessarily, but we build security into our lives. We go directions we shouldn't go, and because those are more immediately satisfying. We choose behaviors that relieve some of the tension, or give us some sense of power or purpose in the moment. We all have idols, and we do them in our impatience and our assumption of having to serve God in ways because God isn't pointing to us. So we do these things. We complain when life doesn't provide for us the way we think it provides. What did the people of Israel lack? They lacked water. So they complained, and God gave them water, and then the next thing happened and they complained again because they still didn't trust. But it wasn't that they were the complaint itself was inherently evil. They needed these things. It was the attitude that went with it. We interpret God in much the same way. Our belief in providence is only partially what we say it is, but it's how we live. Do we truly believe God is in charge in our life? Do we truly believe God is in charge of this country, this world? How do we respond to issues and concerns of politics or news? Do we throw up our hands in despair? Or say, oh no, finally our Savior has come? Where is our view of God's presence in this? And how does our response reflect what our beliefs truly are? And again, some things can't be explained quite yet. And attempts to do so undermine our continued walk. We get stuck in trying to come up with answers, and they get so caught up in that we lose the focus on what we're called to do, our obedience, called to wait to the end. So we're reminded of this eschatology. We should also reckon with the limited autonomy and freedom of human beings. Our existence is possible by virtue of God granting limited autonomy. He honors independence governance. He could have created us in any way, and yet from the very beginning we read he allowed space to make even divergent choices, and these choices have an effect, but God is bringing us back to his purposes. He honors the independence given to us, expects us to take responsibility, but doesn't allow our doings to frustrate his eternal purposes. Again, eschatology sneaks in to even this class. Another approach has been offered by process theology. I mentioned earlier the idea that one of the conflicts in coming to terms with providence is our experience of this world. Classical definitions of God said that God is all-powerful. The fundamental Christian definition of God is all-loving. So we say God is all-powerful and God is all-loving, and yet we experience in this world. And turn on the news and you'll be instantly confronted by suggestions that God is either one or the other, but clearly not both. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, he would put things all to the right. So either God is all-powerful but doesn't care about the 8-year-old who has cancer, or the 37-year-old mom of 2 who is very near death from cancer, or the family who got killed by a drunk driver. Does God care about that? Could God have done something? Or God is all-loving but not all-powerful. He wants things to do right. He wants things to go well, but he's not in charge of it all. He's in the system as well. This latter is a little more where process theology comes. In process theology, the God-world relationship is co-eternal, reciprocal, related, interdependent. They relate to each other. John Cobb's God in the World is a classic formulation of this view. In this view, evil and suffering are neither caused by nor even allowed by God. While God's omnipotent in some sense, he's not sovereign enough. He doesn't control the absolute destiny of everything. He's mighty, but he's not all-controlling and all-determining. So while he doesn't like the idea of evil such as Auschwitz, this wasn't within his realm of control to stop. God provides the lure. It's an invitation to be better, to go the right way, but can neither wills nor can coerce his will over the world. God seeks to convince the world in his involvement in the world. God isn't just a person who's he's beyond us, but he's not beyond all the circumstances of the world. Providence no longer means that God exercises a monopoly of power and compels everything to be just as it is. It means instead that he exercises the optimum persuasive power in relation to whatever is. So God is all loving. God wants things to be right. The world process sometimes moves in different directions. So God is a co-sufferer, a co-experiencer of the world, though bigger and wiser. Evangelical interpretations fall into 3 basic different camps. In Reformed approaches, follows the direction sent by Calvin and Zwingli and Protestant Orthodoxy, such as shown in Louis Berkhof's systematic theology, which discuss the themes of the divine decrees, predestination, and providence, and his use of the threefold typology of conservation, concurrence, and government, the classic definitions we've talked about. One of the most vocal proponents of this contemporary Augustinian Calvinist view is R.C. Sproul, whose influence is seen still very broadly. Millard Erickson uses the twofold typology of preservation and government and advocates a reformed view as well. Another approach. Evangelical Arminians follow the interpretation established by Jacobus Arminius with their idea of limited providence, which we've already talked about. Arminians make a distinction between the divine foreordination and permission. While nothing happens without God's permission, not everything happens with God as its primary cause. God doesn't initiate everything, but sometimes God allows things to happen. And we can think of this in terms of a parent. Sometimes you know your child is doing something wrong, but you let them, you could stop it, but part of the learning process for them is letting them experience. Obviously you step in if you know it's ultimately dangerous, but there are times in which you let kids make their own decisions. A number of contemporary churches affirm this view, such as Free Will Baptists, Pentecostals, those of the Wesleyan tradition, and so on. Theologians such as Tozer, South African Reformed Adrio Koenig, as well as Michael Peterson are representatives of the Arminian interpretations who have written a lot on this topic. Finally, there's an open theist view, which is really a more contemporary version of the Arminian perspective, which has even expanded the Arminian perspective closer somewhere, and we can even say towards what process theology is arguing. An open theist view. They've radicalized the limited providence view and keeping in concept with the idea that God is not only permitting things to happen, God not only withdraws his power, he also withdraws his knowledge. Open theists argue that if God really takes risk, then he cannot know for sure everything that will happen. They remind us that if God really takes risks, there needs to be some meaning to freedom of will. The idea that we have been given freedom has to be a substantive reality. Otherwise, anything it'll quickly fall into some version of determinism. What does it mean to be truly free? Open theists interpret providence as God's resourceful and powerful response to humanity within the frameworks of nature and history. God does not know with absolute certainty all the future holds, but he is able to predict events and respond in such a way that his ultimate and final will for the future is never thwarted. So thus here we say that the open theists are not process theologians. They say God will ultimately bring things to conclusion. They have a strong eschatology. Now what the path and direction of this? Is God just the ultimate general who's able to respond to all, no matter what happens? He doesn't have to know everything, but he's so in charge that no matter what happens, he's able to put things to right. God knows everything that can be known in a given time, that God is omniscient, but being omniscient does not mean for open theists that God has to know such things that are left by God's sovereignty for the decision of human needs. Does God know whether or not you're going to do all the readings this week? An open theist would say that is still a choice left to you, and that God leaves his own knowledge of this, but will know if you've done it, even if I don't know if you've done it or not. I'm not omniscient in the same way God is. But none of God's eternal purposes are going to be compromised or destroyed by human actions, because God is omnipotent. Again, unlike process, God will put all things to right. Now the analogy here, to use one that has been helpful to me in my own wrestling with open theism, is the idea of, say, a diary. Say you have a teenager who has a diary, and you're a little concerned about what your teenager is doing in life, what they're doing with their friends or things, and you know where they keep their diary. They hide it. They have it in a locked cabinet. They write in it every day. You've seen them write in it, but they never want to show you. Now they're gone, and you're worried about them. You have the ability to go in and read their diary, to learn all the things that they write down, the secrets that they're sharing. You have the ability to know everything that is happening and what they plan to do. If let's say they write all the things that they're wanting to do this next week. You have the ability to know that. Now that puts the issue not in terms of ability to know, but relational connection. In a relational purpose, you choose not to use your ability to know those things because of the relational respect you have for their freedom and privacy. You can learn from this, but you choose not to because that would violate their sense of privacy and freedom. Now, it's not an exact analogy, but again, the emphasis based on ability versus relational purposes is important. Just because God is able to do something, can he choose not to do something for the purpose of relationship? That's what an open theist is arguing. Now, both sides use scripture and all the different sides of this, except for are using verses to argue this. So it's not just a debate over scripture. In this purpose, I've simplified it a little bit. But again, what is God able to do? What does God choose to do? Does God choose? Must God choose what he is able to do, or can God choose to do something, withdraw? This is a big debate. Or is God just not able to do something, which is the process response? All of these are trying to come to terms with our experience of the world, in which it's suggested that we have freedom, but that also God is in charge. Well, what does that mean? Stanley Grins has offered a fresh interpretation of providence It doesn't fall easily into any of the three categories, but tries to speak to concerns of contemporary worldview. Fortunately, Stanley Gunz died relatively early in life. He was only 55 before he was able to further some of these approaches. In keeping with his overall focus, namely the theology for the community of God, which is also the title of his one-volume systematic theology, Gunz reminds us that the establishment of community is the highest purpose of providence that derives from a robust theology of creation. In presenting the aspects of the doctrine of providence, he casts the traditional topics to a new meaning and significance. Because older doctrine, older approaches, older categories rested on outdated pre-Newtonian physics. God was needed to secure existence and operation of the world. God operated in these very strict and narrow categories because of the importance of cause and effect and other mechanistic approaches. However, in light of new contemporary views, for Gunz, preservation means that God preserves us in the face of apparent meaninglessness of existence. So an existential approach. It doesn't answer the question, is there meaning to life? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? God preserves our meaning even in the face of apparent meaninglessness. You mean something. Concurrence is the answer to the question of ultimacy. Who is ultimate? Human beings are not autonomous, free to act in accordance with their own purposes, but rather we're dependent, contingent, interconnected beings. If in our era of hypersubjectivity where we define our own self, so often this definition goes counter to operating within society. But then so often society wants to so over-define people that some people lose any kind of diversity or freedom or autonomy. Well, how do we navigate this? Well, this is where God steps in providing both personhood, but also connection, in a connectivity with each other. We are our own self, but we are our own self in the context of all these others who are given meaning and purpose and connection in light of God's work. Government then expresses the certainty that God will bring both the world as a whole and our life to their final goal. This shows us the greatness of God in the face of evil and opposition. He even brings good out of evil. We may not have an explanation for evil. In fact, the Bible acknowledges the question, but often avoids it, like God did with Job. Job accuses God, and God says, did you make the whale? Did you make the sky? God is sovereign. God is in control. But also, God doesn't justify himself. How can we have confidence in the face of evil and frustration and discouragement? Like the people of Israel, oftentimes the call is just to keep walking and moving forward, because only then we see the result of the promise. If we stop in the middle of the wilderness, all we will see is the wilderness, and we can say to God, God, you've left us in the wilderness, and God has been saying all along, keep going, keep having faith, keep trusting. You may not understand this, but I am with you.